Hey, and welcome to Cluster 6 for first grade. In this cluster, we are looking at just two standards, but they're pretty important standards. It's geometry, excuse me, 1G1 and 1G2, reason with shapes and their attributes. Um, so the title of this cluster is Distinguishing and Composing. And basically, those are the big words pulled out of both of the standards. So we're looking at this over a 3-week period. And for KG1, we're distinguishing between defining and non-defining attributes and create those shapes with defining attributes. So when we talk about defining, we're talking about their sides, their vertices, their angles. Non-defining would be things like color, orientation, size, right? Um, because the size of a shape or the color of it doesn't define that shape. So they will be building and drawing triangles, rectangles, squares, trapezoids, hexagons, and circles. So those are six shapes for first grade. Excuse me, six 2D shapes. And then building cubes, rectangular prisms, cones, spheres, and cylinders. Um, so that's all in G1, and that's a lot in G1. And G2 is create composite shapes by making two-dimensional composite shapes using the rectangle, squares, trapezoids, triangles, and even half circles, naming the components of the new shape. And then we would do the same with a 3D shape. Okay, so let's quickly take a look at the coherence of these standards. So here we are in first grade. This is KG1. And excuse me, I don't know why I want to keep saying K. 1G1, we just talked about this standard. And so just knowing where they're coming from in kindergarten. So last year, they analyzed and compared 2 and 3D shapes with different sizes and orientations using some informal language, talking about their similarities, differences, and attributes. Then they talked about shapes in the real world. Um, so, like using sticks, clay balls, and then drawing the shapes. And then that leads us to our work in first grade, and then in second grade, they are going to recognize and draw triangles, quadrilaterals, pentagons, and hexagons. So here's a new shape, right? Having specified attributes, describe attributes of rectangular prisms and cubes. So really the difference here is distinguish between these attributes where in second grade we're really expecting them to know the attributes. So in first grade they're doing a lot of discovering the different attributes of the shapes. And then for 1G2 in kindergarten, what relates to this work is composing simple shapes to form larger shapes. So, for example, can you join these two triangles with the full sides touching to make a rectangle? Right. So here they were really just taking simple shapes and making another 2D shape with it. But here we're going to actually make composite shapes from 2 and 3 dimensional shapes. So there really isn't much work in second grade that really works on this. Um, but later on in later grade levels, and like in sixth grade, they have to find and maybe seventh grade too, they have to find the volume of three-dimensional composite shapes, right? In in fourth grade, they begin finding the area of composite shapes. So for instance, here is this, they call it a rectilinear figure. How can we decompose this shape? So that's directly related to the work that they're going to do in first grade. Or maybe they break it here and then they're asked to find the area. And then, like I said, in middle school, please don't uh, judge my drawing. They're going to be asked to find the volume of three-dimensional composite shapes. And maybe it isn't something that simple, but that is, well, maybe it's like that. A triangular prism on top of a rectangular prism. So just disregard this one. But they have to be able to decompose and compose those 3D shapes or composite 3D shapes. Again, directly related to this work in first grade. So you guys are setting the foundation for some very important work in later grades. Okay, so this is so true. Early geometry is much more than vocabulary and naming shapes. It really has to do with spatial sense and spatial awareness. Um, I know this doesn't seem too important in the grand scheme of things of the work that you've done all year, but it it is, because I mean this is sort of a real world skill, right? Really developing and being able to see how things are laid out. Engineers have a really good spatial orientation, spatial sense. So this is important in the grand scheme of things of life. Um, and then when we look at what students should be exposed to, using tangrams, that helps build composite shapes, attribute blocks, and pattern blocks. So giving them exposure to all of these different types of shapes really helps them build that awareness. Um, so just looking at a variety of examples of a single type of shape. So for example, triangles that are similar, maybe in orientation, but different in size or color, providing examples and non-examples of shapes. So to highlight the attributes. So in first grade, students use their understanding of defining attributes to identify, name, build, and draw. And we talked about the shapes already. And then students combine 2D shapes to create composite 3D shapes, or excuse me, 2D shapes. So for example, two triangles can be composed to make a square. And then we would do the same thing with 3D shapes. Okay, we just talked about this, being exposed to a variety of sizes and contexts to avoid misconceptions. So for instance, students will see this as a rectangle. Here, I know we don't really necessarily talk about parallel sides, but here we have two pairs of parallel sides. But if this were, let's see if I can do this, rotated, right? The student may not see that as a rectangle anymore because it has a different orientation. So it's basically turned differently, right? And then just being able to manipulate shapes in a variety of contexts. So really being able to use pattern blocks, I don't know if you guys have any 3D building shapes. Those are really cool that they can take the net of something and build it up to make a 3D shape is really cool. They could, or there's just those wooden blocks together, putting them on top of each other. But then calling out, 3D shapes or 2D shapes and their attributes in the real world. So in the hallway, in the playground, the cafeteria, in your classroom. Asking them to go home that day to look for a cube, and maybe coming back the next day and explaining what they saw, right? What they identified at either on the ride home or at home. So, and then just paying attention to the fact that, this is the first time we're really looking at 3D shapes in depth. So, a misconception would be for like a 3D shape. So taking a cube and saying that it's a square because we're looking at it only at its face versus looking at it as a 3D shape is made up of a bunch of squares, right? So that's basically what it says here. Identify all of the 3D shapes or the faces of a 3D shape that can be described using the names of 2D shapes. Sorry, I get really excited about geometry. I really like it a lot. And it's fun, right? The kids have a lot of fun with it. So we've talked a lot about this. Let's just try to pay attention to what is important um, here for us in first grade. So students understand that defining attributes are always present. Features that classify a particular object, such as, so we're talking about the number of sides, the length of sides, and the number of angles. And just keep in mind, and I know you know this about your kids, is that angles are really um, abstract concepts. Like I know kids can see lines, right? Because they can draw them. Um, but really knowing what an angle is and how they're created. I know that we don't get into that, and really, it's not. We don't touch on that or begin to teach that until fourth grade. So, not necessarily harping on that too much, but calling that out that there are three angles. Um, as well as the vertices, right? Those are corners. So maybe even using specific language, like letting them use corners, let them get there, but just constantly try to get students that more formal, precise language. I know a first grader is going to struggle with the term vertice or vertex, excuse me, but corner would, you know, as long as they could show it, that also works as well. Sorry, I talked a lot about that, but then I remembered we were talking about first graders. So um, definitely expose them to the vocabulary. So, for instance, vertex, making sure that they've heard it. And on your anchor charts, really pay attention to that wordage as well. So, for instance, here's an example of anchor charts created from, or that I found on Tools for Teachers for this cluster. So they even use the word vertice, just making sure that students can have access to that language in a verbal display, in a visual display. So this was found on Tools for Teachers. And that's a great example that you can make with kids. Okay. And then G2, so we're creating composite shapes. So, for instance, here's the check for understanding. What shapes can you create with triangles? So I made a square using two triangles. So again, this is that idea that even though has a different orientation, it's not sitting up like we would normally see. It's rotated. It's still a square, and that you can make a trapezoid with four triangles, and you can make a rectangle, and then looking at half circles as well. Okay, and I think that is basically it. We kind of hit all of the main things for those standards. So I was looking on here at the lessons, and you can see there aren't many lessons at all. Um, I like the shape sort as an introductory lesson to explore 2 and 3D shapes. Um, specifically, 3D shapes are not in this lesson, but you could definitely modify it to work for 3D shapes. So you see here the language that the math language is very precise, and again, could be difficult for first graders. Wow. So I saw this number 3 down here. Here's another example of a anchor chart for the types of attributes of a 2D shape. And then just going through the lesson, just really talking about the exploration phase of it and coming back together, the debrief phase. What I really wanted to highlight down here was at the very bottom at the resources, they have your shape cards. And then they also have some word cards, which are super important. Remember to get them to connect the language to the shapes. And then building shapes. Here they're beginning to talk about building 3D shapes from 2D shapes. And it comes with just the same format that we've seen in all of the other lessons. Even a writing component piece, which is really good. And then, let's see, where is it? Okay, so we get down here to the bottom, and there's this activity called Eliminate It. And Eliminate It is very similar to, I'm going to close this out, Which One Doesn't Belong? So I wanted to give you a quick look at a video where this teacher is doing a Which One Doesn't Belong. And these kids are using some very informal language. I know it says 16 minutes. I'm not going to play it all the way through. I just wanted to give you a brief look at what it would look like in instruction.
In this particular Which One Doesn't Belong, they are going to be comparing two-dimensional shapes and describing similarities and differences between these 4 different pictures. They're going to probably use some real...
So, sorry, I forgot to tell you, this is of kindergarten, but this is I just wanted you to get the idea of the routine of the Which One Doesn't Belong, or Eliminate It, as they call it on Tools for Teachers.
Informal language when they talk about parts of it, orientation of some of these shapes, and then they may just describe some of the attributes, how many sides they have, whether they have straight sides or they see the oval and say no sides. Those are the types of things we're looking for, just to see how students categorize these shapes and differentiate between the 4 different images. So I hope you enjoy. Always looking forward to learning together. So please leave your feedback. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and if you try it out in your own classroom, definitely want to hear about it.
Good morning, class. What we are going to do today is called a Which One Doesn't Belong. So when I uncover this picture, there's going to be 4 things there. And your job is to figure out which one of those things does not belong. And when you have an idea of which one you think doesn't belong, just give me a thumbs up. And then if you can think of another reason it doesn't belong, or a third reason it doesn't belong, that's the way that you could show me. Okay? All right. Here is your picture for today. Which one of these does not belong?
So again, I just want to stop here for a second because there isn't not always one wrong answer, or excuse me, there isn't always one right answer. So for instance, a kid may say the red triangle doesn't belong because it's red, or they may say this oval doesn't belong or circle doesn't belong because it doesn't have straight sides. So there are different things that kids could come up with.
The red one because
So at this point, she's had them turn and talk to their partner about which one they think doesn't belong.
it's different colors. I'm blaming you.
Let's come back together. 1, 2, and 3. Okay, somebody tell me which one they think didn't belong and why. Which one do you think didn't belong and why?
Levi.
Ransom, which one do you think didn't belong and why?
The oval.
The oval. Which one is the oval? Can you just point to it from where you are?
That one.
This one. And you said this was an oval? And why doesn't that oval belong to you?
Yeah. It has no points.
It has no points. Somebody else. What image do you think didn't belong and why? Minnie, which one? The red one. And why didn't the red one belong?
Because that's the one that's blue and that one's red.
Yes.
So we're going to fast forward it.
The one with 4 sides?
Yes. 1, 2,
No?
3, 4, 5.
Oh, this one has 5.
And so you can see, very similar to a number talk, she really has recorded everything that the kids have said all along the sides of each shape.
The arrow has stuff.
This one has 6 sides. you think. So is this the only one with 4 sides?
No.
Yeah.
The oval doesn't even have sides. Yeah, and the oval.
Minnie, can you tell me that they all don't belong in the same group? They're not the same. Good. All right, here's your job in the next minute. Are you ready? So we have so many good reasons that each of these don't belong. I want you to see if you can come up with another reason that one of the shapes that we haven't said yet, another reason that one of the shapes doesn't belong. I'm going to give you a minute with your.
Okay, so that's basically how the routine works. And you'll notice that they're using, again, very informal language. So you could use this as your first activating strategy for the unit, or excuse me, for the cluster. You could use it and have students actually use more precise language. If you actually were to Google which one doesn't belong, you would come up with this webpage, which is a whole bunch of which one doesn't belong, right? And the cool part is they have it separated by shapes and numbers. And I've done this, I've modeled this activity at a first grade classroom at Gregory. I've worked with the instructional coaches with it. If this is something you're interested to in learning more about, I'd be more than happy to help you. But you see, there's so many opportunities here to bring in different shapes, right? So it doesn't always have to be in this 4-quadrant thing, but most of the time it is, whereas like this one's not. And it's, basically every grade level. So just kind of scrolling through, like here, oh, I did this one with the 5th grade class actually, but it could totally be used for 1st grade as well. Just to hear what students say and what they're thinking, see what they're thinking about shapes. So this one would be a good one as well. Just wanted to leave that there. And then I just wanted to make sure everybody is aware that we now have access for the rest of the year, whether your principal bought it or not. We all have access to Teacher Toolbox. And for this unit, we would be, or excuse me, for this cluster, we would be looking at Unit 6 shapes. And I know sometimes it's tempting to kind of like just go to these little pieces right here. But if we look at the whole lesson 28, and let's see, we go to the teacher edition. I'm not sure what the difference is here. Oh, that's lesson 30. Okay, so, and if I click just on the teacher edition, open it up, it basically lays out the scope and sequence, whereas if I go back to this version, it looks like lesson 28 literally is just one lesson. But when I open up lesson 28 here and I look at the pacing, within whole class, it could be 4 days, or within within stations, you could use all of these lessons 1, 2, and 3, or activities within lesson 28 to last over the same amount of days. So for instance, use what you know, that is day 1. So I go down here to use what you know, making sure to read all of this information around here. And that it would be lesson 1, right? Along with this page as well. So I just want to make sure everybody knew about the Tools for Teachers lessons. And then on illustrative mathematics, they have some tasks that are aligned to both of these standards. Okay, I think I've talked enough for this one cluster.